The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the TimeformUS takeover of the DRF Friday Breeders' Cup webinar. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatale. Really excited to be here with two guests whose opinions I really value and am looking forward to hearing over the course of this show about the Friday races at Churchill Downs. Before we get going, just a reminder that on Friday, we've got some guaranteed pools to look forward to. There's a $500,000 guaranteed pick 5 on races 1 through 5, a $1 million guaranteed late pick 5 on the races we'll be talking about throughout the course of this show, races 5 through 9, and a $1.5 million guaranteed all Breeders' Cup pick 4 on races 6 through 9. We're going to start off by talking about a race that's become an official Breeders' Cup race for the first time in 2018. It goes as the 5th on Friday. It is the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf Sprint. Before we get to that, I will introduce my panel. First up, he is the lead figure maker for TimeformUS and always a very popular guest when we have him on these webinars or on the Daily Racing Form Players podcast, which I have the pleasure to host. Craig Milkowski. Craig, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Peter. Glad to be here.
Excellent. And I'm also going to bring in the Timeform lead US analyst, who's proved himself to be one of the sharpest handicappers and horse players around, both on Twitter and for the work he does for both TimeformUS blog and Daily Racing Form. Welcome back to the show, David Aragona. David, how are you today?
Doing great. This is always a fun week, and I'm looking forward to talking about these races a little bit.
Well, let's start right there, David, and we'll start with you from a betting perspective, from a handicapping perspective. What are your thoughts on this year's Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf Sprint?
You know, whereas on Saturday, I think there are a bunch of races where, you know, it looks like the favorites are going to be tough. These Friday races, especially towards the start of these, first few Breeders' Cup races, it's just so tough. These races are so wide open. In my opinion, if you have to kind of lean on one horse as a horse to beat in this turf sprint, it's probably Soldier's Call. Just watching his races in France and England, he just seems to run well every single time. I mean, this is just a pure sprinter, a horse that is really well developed late in his 2-year-old season. I mean, you don't often see 2-year-olds run as competitively as he did in that Group 1 against older horses on the Arc de Triomphe day. And I mean, he almost won that race. He just seems like a really solid horse, and the 5.5 furlongs is absolutely perfect for him. Love the draw down towards the inside, and he seems to run over any kind of turf course. So I'm not too concerned about all the rain in the forecast. I am interested in a few of Wesley Ward's horses in this race. I guess Shang is the one that's going to take a lot of money, but I just don't like all of the storylines around this horse, the fact that she's had some issues, has missed a bunch of races. So I'm more interested in a couple of the bigger prices. Obviously, one of those is Chelsea Cloisters, who just got run down by Strike Silver, who's the more favorite in this race. Of those two, I definitely want Chelsea Cloisters out of that Indian Summer Stakes because she was contesting that fast pace. You see those red color-coded pace figures that indicate that she really was against the race flow that day, since it really just fall apart at the end and played to the strength of a horse like Strike Silver. I like her, but at a much bigger price. I'm also interested in Stillwater Cove, who beat Chelsea Cloisters at Saratoga. Stillwater Cove, I know that was regarded as somewhat of a fluke that she beat Chelsea Cloisters on August 15th, but I actually liked her race when she came back from the Natama last time. That was going a mile. It's probably a little too far for her, and that was another race that really fell apart at the end. You see those red color-coded pace figures and other horses that are coming out of that race. I think it really played to their strengths, the fact that they were coming from so far behind, and Stillwater Cove made that first move to take the lead and just kind of fell apart at the end, but I thought she had every right to. I like the turn back for her, and I think she's dangerous. And then on the outside, you've got Pocket Dynamo, another horse coming over from Europe. You want to watch his last race in the Cornwallis Stakes because he really never had any place to run. He was just kind of stuck in behind horses. That was also his first start off a layoff, so he's likely to go forward off that race. I think he's somewhat interesting at a price.
Lots of interesting angles there. Before we go any further, we're getting a little bit of an echo on the broadcast. I'm not sure what's causing that, but if our producer Jake or Craig might want to just try muting the microphone, obviously, Craig, not when you're speaking, but when others are speaking, maybe we can get rid of some of that little bit of echo. And with that little technical matter out of the way, David, you bring up some really interesting angles, including one of my favorites, the old school Andy Beyer move into a hot pace for Stillwater Cove and then throwing in the cutback. Some definitely interesting stuff there. Craig, how do you see this race? Is it a race it's going to be a big part of your betting for this Breeders' Cup?
I'm definitely interested in this race, but I'm going to take a different approach than what David's going to do. I'm basically tossing out all the Euros. It's just such a different game sprinting over there. Almost all the races are run on a straightaway. I don't think they have quite the speed that we do here. So the turn's a new deal here. And we do have a little bit of history, not with 2-year-olds, but we've seen in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint, Euros have basically had no success whatsoever that I can remember off the top of my head. I kind of looked back and scanned it, and just from my history, I don't remember Euros doing very well. And there have been some that were bet well, including down the hill at Santa Anita. Of course, that seemed like it would favor the Euros, but they just haven't been able to get it done. So my way of attacking this race is just going to be to stick with the American horses and look for some value. And the horse I landed on is Bulletin, which at 10-1 morning line, he ran a really nice figure first time out at 105. He's only run one time, and that was Todd Pletcher actually entered him in a stakes race at Gulfstream for his debut. He was bet down to 5-2 that day, and he just hammered the field. I mean, he went right to the front, ran away from him, did it as easy as you could ask. And he's the one I'm probably going to be keying on in here if that price holds. I'm also, some of the Wesley Wards, I'm going to look to play them in exactas with Bulletin. I'm with David. I like Stillwater Cove. I didn't know the stories about Shang, but I still think she's probably worth using, And part of my Euro thing, too, is we've seen Wesley Ward take horses overseas to Ascot and also in Deauville in France and have plenty of success. And that's kind of what's led me to go this route, to just try to get ahead of the curve and toss the Euros and see if I can find some value. The other horse I'm interested in outside the Wesley Wards is Strike Silver. I think his last race, he was hammered at the start, dropped way back. And, if you had a ticket on him that day based on his running style first 2 times out, you were probably ready to tear it up. He only got a 91 TimeformUS speed figure that day, coming from way back. But I think you can basically draw a line through that race from a numeric standpoint. I think he's probably got much more in the tank that we saw. And with any kind of break, I expect a much better number from him this time.
There you have it, our thoughts on the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf Sprint. Once again, that's the race that will be the anchor leg, paying off the $500,000 guaranteed early pick 5. It will be kicking off the $1 million guaranteed late pick 5 on races 5 through 9. Now we move on to the first race of the $1.5 million guaranteed all Breeders' Cup pick 4, races 6 through 9 on Friday. Race 6 being the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies Turf. This is a race that many are expecting to have a heavy favorite. And Craig, will keep it with you, and I'll start off with a simple question. Are you with or against Newspaper of Record in here?
For me, I think she's the most likely winner on the card. She was impressive last time out, got much the best speed figure in the field. None of the Euros have time form ratings that compare to her number. She also did it over a yielding course. I'm not sure if we'll be yielding on Friday, but it certainly shouldn't be firm based on the weather reports. And just this time of year, I'm sure the ground's going to have some give in it. She's trained by the best trainer, a guy that's dominated this race over recent years, and, ridden by a Rad Ortiz. And I just think she looks like a standout.
From a betting point of view, Craig, is this a single in horizontals type race, or one where you might get involved vertically? And if you're getting involved vertically, who else are you going to have try to run with her?
It's probably a race where I would single her. If there's one horse I would like, it's a horse that ran second to her last time, Varenka, maybe in exotics, try to get her in the second or third. I like that 20-1 morning line. Look, she ran second, beaten 6.5, but, she was beaten by the horse I think is probably the most likely winner over the 2 days. I think she's a little bit better than Concrete Rose, in my opinion, who's second choice on the morning line, I believe. And, you know, I just wasn't blown away by her. She's been solid, but she ran a better number sprinting than she did routing. I didn't think a whole lot of that field last time out that she beat. So I'm going to try to get her out of the verticals and get number 9 Varenka into them.
David, what's your view on this year's Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies turf?
Yeah, I'm pretty much with Craig on that line of thinking that Newspaper of Record is just way the horse to beat. I'm not big on singling horses in general, but I do think if you're playing an ABC type ticket, she is a lone A in a race where maybe the only other horses you want to use are C type horses. Newspaper of Record, I've just been really impressed with both of her races. I agree with everything Craig said about her speed figure last time. I mean, it really holds up based on the other horses that were in that race, and it suggests that she is every bit as fast, if not significantly faster than the Euros that came over for this race. I don't think there's a whole lot of quality among the foreign contingent in here. And I like that she's handled yielding turf courses before. I mean, just to kind of touch upon the weather again, I mean, looking at the forecast for Louisville, I mean, it seems like they're going to get maybe up to 3 inches of rain. That's really significant. I mean, I'll be surprised if the turf course is less than yielding. It could even be soft, and that's a major factor for a lot of the American horses. But Newspaper of Record has handled it. She's got that European pedigree, which suggests that, it's really going to be no problem for her. And I like that she's got this really uncomplicated running style. She's got plenty of early speed, and she seems to break well out of the gate. She can just get out in front, and that's what the TimeformUS pace projector certainly is predicting. It does show a fast pace, but she's, been able to set legitimate paces in her prior races and keep going. So I think she's just way the horse to beat. I'm not against her by any means. Just to touch on a couple of alternatives that I think are somewhat interesting. If I'm going to use any of the Euros, it's going to be Just Wonderful, the number 4. I don't know what happened to back in that Group 1 attempt in the Moycler Stud Stakes, because she didn't really seem to ever pick up that day. But her 2 races that bookend that effort, I really like. I think she was very visually impressive in that Flame of Tara back on September 1st. And then last time out, she did it the right way, beating a Group 2 field. Her time form ratings don't suggest that she's quite at this level, but it seems like she's the kind of filly that's really bred to run longer. I think maybe 1.25 miles next year might be what she really wants to do. And she's a horse that I think her stamina over this kind of turf course might really help her. So I'm somewhat interested in her. And then at a bigger price, the number 13, My Gal Betty. I actually really liked the race that she ran in the Talma last time. Running against La Pelosa, who got a strong pace to close into that day. My Gal Betty sort of made the first move, and La Pelosa snuck up inside her. But I thought My Gal Betty finished up pretty gamely considering that. And I like her prior races. I think she handled the yielding turf course 2 back in that Pletchett Glimpse Stakes on August 25th. And that's just another reason to like her today, given the weather. So I'm somewhat interested in her. I don't love the post position, but she's going to be a price, so I'll throw her right underneath.
Just a quick note on the weather. The rain has begun, and it is also notable that even before this rain began, just being out there for training this morning and seeing some horses galloping over the turf course, plenty of cut in the ground to begin with. So there's absolutely no way we're going to be looking at firm ground, as both guests have correctly surmised. Going to be plenty of cut in these races Friday and Saturday, and that's definitely something you're going to want to factor into your handicapping. And with that, let's move on to race 7, the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies. David, we'll keep it with you.
So I think you kind of have to make the determination for yourself how big of a favorite you think Bellafina is supposed to be, because she's been very visually impressive in her 3 wins, all graded stakes races, the last 2 grade ones. And whatever speed figures you're looking at, she does have a significant edge over this field. I'm not sure I quite believe that she's as dominant as either the TimeformUS figures or the buyers make it seem, because I'm just not 100% sure what she's been beating out in California, even though she's done it the right way. But she deserves a ton of respect. I'm not too concerned about the outside post position, even though the pace projector is predicting a fast pace, because when you really break it down, I mean, she's likely to get out to the lead with Serengeti Empress, and I don't see her being any more than 2 or 3 wide early as long as she breaks fine. So I'm afraid of Bellafina. I think she is a horse that you have to include. I'm against her. I'm not against her by any means. But I do think this race is a bit more wide open than it might seem at first glance, just because a lot of these fillies are untested and have never faced a field this large or competition of this level before. Serengeti Empress, I think, is an interesting horse to consider in this race off those 2 lopsided wins, Bellas Park and Churchill Downs. She's never really faced a field this tough before, certainly not in the last 2 races, but she's done it the right way. I do think she's going to get out to a clear lead in here because I doubt they're going to be, hell-bent on sending Delafine in front of her early. So she's dangerous. She's handled Churchill Downs before. It's just she hasn't really run a speed figure either looking at TimeformUS or buyers suggest that she's quite as fast as these. So I do think she needs to improve, and I'm not sure she can overcome any sort of adversity. But she is a horse that I would use somewhere underneath. You can call me having a New York bias or an East Coast bias, but I'm interested in both of the horses coming out of New York, especially Jaywalk. I really liked her Frisette. I'm kind of interested to hear what Craig has to say about the speed figure for that race because it must have been a hard number to make. The time came up oddly fast considering the other races that day. Just kind of looking at how Craig's number was made and how the buyers were created, it looked like the buyer kind of broke it out and compared it to the last race on the card, which went at 7 furlongs and was much slower. And I think Craig broke out the route races on that card to kind of compare it to that. I'm not sure that the race is quite as slow as the TimeformUS figure suggests. I feel like just visually watching it, those horses ran a little bit faster. But I like Jaywalk a lot. I like the work that John Service does. I think she ran exceptionally well to win that Frisette, stepping off 3, 5, and 5.5 furlong races. She's definitely bred to be a router, and she proved in her prior start at Delaware Park that she's perfectly comfortable rating. So I predict that she'll get a stalking trip this day. Joel Rosario chose her over Sipican Harbor. I just think there are a lot of signs that suggest that Jaywalk is a pretty nice filly, and I'm not sure that she's really as much slower as Delafina as the figure suggests. And then Sipican Harbor, if that fast pace develops, she might get the right trip in this race. I know she also got a fast pace in the spinaway, but I love the way that she finished up that race. She does have some sprint pedigree on the dam side, but she's by Orb, so I see no reason why she shouldn't handle at least a mile in a 16th. And I just think this filly has real ability. And if you've been following New York racing recently, Gary Contessa has had the Belmont meet of a lifetime. I mean, I think he was second in the standings by quite a ways to Chad Brown. He's really never been training at this level before. So Sipican Harbor appears to be coming into this race off a strong series of workouts, and I would not discount her at a price.
Craig, let's start with you, and let's start with the discussion of that figure that David's talking about. Was that a difficult figure for you to make on Jaywalk? Craig, are you maybe still muted? I'm guessing the old Jonathan Kinchin problem that viewers or listeners will be very familiar with from the DRF Players podcast, not coming off the mute there?
Yep, I did it, Jonathan, that's for sure. Hopefully you can hear me now.
We got you, my friend. So the question was about Jaywalk and that figure. Was what, as David was surmising, was that a particularly difficult number to make? And what kind of confidence do you have about the decisions you made in the end?
It was a difficult number. David had it pegged right in that I split the longer races apart from the sprints that day. It's one I kind of try to monitor these things as time goes on, but in 2018, that's not always easy. Here we're a month later almost, and very few of the horses have run back. That's a common problem for us figure guys. Used to be every 2 or 3 weeks, you could go back to a race and 5 horses have run back, and now it's usually you go back a month later and none of them have. But in this case, like David said, in these situations, I tend to err on the side of caution. I don't want to overrate. I'd rather underrate a horse a little bit, especially a 2-year-old that's, has every right to develop, than I would overrate him and have people betting off a number I'm not confident in. So, I tend to temper it a little bit. I'm with him. I mean, I think Jaywalk did everything was asked of her that day. She won really easy at a nice price. 6-1. She wasn't pressed very hard, set slow fractions. So I'm not sure she's a horse that needs the lead. A lot of times you'll see these wire-to-wire winners, and you see a horse like Serengeti Empress in here and figure, oh, she can't keep up with her, so I'm going to toss her. But, you don't want to pigeonhole these 2-year-olds into running styles too early in their career. And, even though we have her listed as a speed horse, I don't think she necessarily has to be. She can probably be more of a tracker or a mid-pack. I'm with David. I think Delafina is the horse to beat. She definitely has the best numbers, but the California horses, they do tend to be better on dirt than New York in recent years. But we saw what Good Magic did last year in the juveniles, beating the hyped horses. So I'm going to look for a price as well. I'm looking at Serengeti Empress as one who could maybe just be so fast she could steal away and open up too big of a gap here. And if it doesn't work for her, I'm with Sippican Harbor. Like I said, her last figure was a little low, but this was a sprint race. She did what she had to do. I'm one that's not quick to downgrade a horse that wins a race despite a slow figure, especially when she had a 105 in her prior outing. So she showed me some versatility. She won wire to wire when she broke her maiden, and then she came from I think she was dead last coming into the stretch to get up and win. So, I'd use Bellafina, maybe even make her an A, but I certainly wouldn't be singling her, and I'd throw in the two horses David liked as well.
All right, it makes sense. Some good thoughts there on the first of the two dirt races we'll be discussing in this show. I should mention also that listeners have the opportunity to ask questions through the webinar tool. We've got a couple of good ones we'll get to at the end. It does look like we'll have some time for questions before it's all said and done here on the TimeformUS takeover of DRF's Breeders' Cup Friday preview show. But before we get to those questions, we got two more races to talk about. And the first of those is the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf, a race that Europe, Ireland specifically, but Europe in general, have had some success in over the years, certainly more so than on the female side. And Craig, we'll start with you. You're going anti-Euro in the sprint. What are you doing with the European runners in this edition of the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf?
I'm the same here. I guess the best of them is supposed to be Anthony Van Dyke. He draws a terrible post of 14. It's not great for sure. And I just don't think he's that much better than our horses here. One thing I should mention, was anybody else shocked to scan the entries and see that Chad Brown had no runners in here and yet Bob Baffert has one? I couldn't believe it when I saw that.
It's unusual for the turf.
Yeah, I'd have to guess off the top of my head this is Baffert's first ever runner in the juvenile turf. I'm probably wrong, as with most things, but I sure can't remember one.
Yeah, me either. I think you might be right about that speculation. If there was one, I can't recall it.
Right. The horse I like the most in here is 40 Under. He's been really impressive in New York. He's won both his turf starts. He won the Grade 3 Pilgrim over yielding turf, which, as we've discussed, is probably what we're going to get here. He did get a nice setup that day, but there's a good chance he's going to get one again, on Friday. And what particularly impressed me with the horses, turf routing is not really Jeremiah Englehart's specialty. He's one of my favorite trainers in New York. I love betting on his horses in the right spots. But he's, mostly a dirt guy, and especially dirt sprints. So I don't want to say this is, he can't train turf horses, as obviously he can. But it's almost like this horse is, going against the grain here. He's able to overcome Jeremiah's slight weakness at turf routers and win two. He did it with a nice figure of 110. So I'm looking forward to making a win bet on 40 Under.
Very, very interesting. He's been one of the buzz horses of the week. I'll say that much as well. David, what are your thoughts on the BC Juvenile Turf?
I think this race is pretty wide open. There aren't quite as many Euros in this race, but I do think you want to focus in on Anthony Van Dyke as the one that is really the best of those. I would respect this horse. I know the 14 post position is a real question mark, but just based on the quality of the races he's coming out of, I do want to emphasize that Quarto and Too Darn Hot, who beat him in his last two starts, they are considered to be two of the best, if not the two outright best 2-year-olds in Europe. And especially two back in that national stakes, he really gave a strong challenge to Quarto in the final quarter mile of that race and was just barely turned away. So this is a really quality horse that Aidan O'Brien has sent over. I know the post position is a big question mark, but he's handled yielding and soft ground, and I have a ton of respect for this guy. I think that this horse is going to be pretty tough to beat as long as he runs his race and gets any kind of trip. So I'm definitely using him strongly, but this is like I said, it's a wide open race, and I don't want to key too strongly on a horse that's going to be a relatively short price. I agree with Craig that 40 Under is a really nice horse, and he's got a lot of talent. I've liked both of his starts on turf in New York. I do want to briefly comment on that Pilgrim speed figure, and I'm not, I don't want to make it seem like I'm just picking on Craig's numbers just because we have the opportunity to have him here. I think it's interesting to talk about some of these because you do have to make some decisions sometimes when you're making these figures because they're not always clear cut as you hope they'd be. And the day that 40 under ran, it was a yielding turf course, of course. I mean, we saw that so many times in New York throughout this fall with all the rain that we got. And there was another mile and 16th inner turf race on that card that featured a much slower pace and went slower, but that was for older horses. And I just feel like the numbers that 40 under got in the Pilgrim and also some like at Hot Brown, the fact that, that we gave them higher numbers than some older horses just doesn't quite jive for me. But I do think that was one of the faster prep races. Maybe it's not 10 points faster than the other American horses, but I do think it's one of the faster races. I liked the race that 40 under ran that day. He did get a pretty good trip, but he kind of had to awkwardly swing wide at the top of the stretch, and he finished off that race really well. He handled the yielding ground, which is a good sign. I also think some like Hot Brown is not impossible out of that race. He kind of inherited the lead a bit too soon and seemed, like it's not like he, got green or anything, but he just was leading for a long way on a yielding turf course, which sometimes can be tough to do. And he battled on pretty gamely when 40 under came to him. So I think he's a perfectly viable candidate in this race at a more enticing price. Just looking at some others of the Americans current as a horse I would want to use, I was really impressed with his finish in that Bourbon Stakes. He kind of never looked like he was going to get there coming down the stretch, but he really kicked it into another gear in the final 16th of a mile to get up that day. I liked his prior race at Belmont where he handled a good turf course that might have been on the more yielding side of good. That course had still taken a lot of rain that first week at Belmont. He beat some decent horses that day. Some others that finished farther behind him have come back to run faster in subsequent starts. So I do think courage is the real deal, and that speed figure last time makes him somewhat competitive in here. And then, looking at a bigger bomb, the number 2 horse, Uncle Benny, is a horse that's somewhat interesting to me. I'm always afraid of chasing service horses, and I know he's only gone 6 furlongs so far, but this horse has a pedigree to suggest he wants to run all day. I mean, the dam, I think, is out of Starer, who, won graded stakes going a mile and 1/8, maybe even a mile and a quarter. So there's plenty of stamina in this pedigree. And you want to note the day that he ran on October 7th at Belmont Park, that was a time when both of the rails were set at 0 feet on the inner and Widener turf courses. And that ground down towards the inside, right on the hedge, had gotten very fresh and it was really the place to be. And Uncle Benny was one of the only horses throughout that time period that rallied right down the center of the course over ground that didn't appear to be, quite as conducive to horses making moves on the outside. So I do think you want to upgrade his performance considering the trip that he got that day. He did get a fast pace to close into, but that said, I think he ran better than it might seem. And I'm not going to be surprised if he's able to stretch out and show a bit more speed from that inside post position. So he's the price that I'd want to use. But this is a kind of a spread race for me. I think Anthony Van Dyke is going to be tough, but the post position gives me just enough doubt to use some of the Americans.
Lots of good stuff to unpack there. We did have a listener point out that the post 14 at a Breeders' Cup in Kentucky in this race has been successful before with Hit It a Bomb a few years back, who ended up going off at what I'm going to say, with the glorious benefit of hindsight, was a significant overlay because of fear of the post position. So that's maybe something to take a little bit of a look at with Anthony Van Dyke before making final decisions. David points out about the race that Current comes out of and how live the race looks based on figures horses have run subsequently. That's something that you can check and look at very easily in TimeformUS, utilizing the charts feature and going in and having an opportunity to see what numbers horses ran, not only in the race of the chart you're looking at, but what they've done before and after. One of the many advantages you can get very easily by using TimeformUS. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about, David mentioned the figure question about 40 under's last race, and I just wanted to let Craig weigh in on that before we move forward. Craig, same question as before. What's your confidence level in that number?
David actually wrote to me about that a couple of days ago, and I have done some looking, and his point's valid. We talk about that. David knows he's always welcome to write me about figures, and he does. He takes me up on it. We usually have some pretty good discussions on those. This is one, it's just really a tough call. It could be a little lower. It definitely couldn't be higher. I think the 110 is probably about the max you could get for that race. So I'd say use it with a little bit of trepidation. I'm not sure how important the figure? Is it, if it's a 105 instead of a 110 in a turf route like this, does it really matter that much? It probably doesn't from a betting standpoint. But like I said, David's always welcome to ask me about figures, and he does, and I never take it the wrong way. As a matter of fact, I encourage it. I tell him that all the time. I love hearing from him.
That's a great attitude, and you've shown also in your Twitter following, both of you interacting with fans. It's great. We can answer questions in a webinar format like this. Twitter gives an opportunity to do that regularly. I'll take a minute to let you guys each give out your Twitter handles. Craig, I'll start with you.
Mine is TimeformUS Figs, just FIGS at the end of TimeformUS.
And David, I think you're at Horse to Watch, singular. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Excellent, excellent. All right, some good stuff there. We have some questions to get to at the end. First, let's talk about this 9th race. It's the anchor leg for both the $1 Million Guaranteed Late Pick 5 and $1.5 million Guaranteed All Breeders' Cup Pick 4. It is the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. We have, presumably, we're going to have a heavy favorite in here in Game Winner for Bob Baffert. David, do you see this race as going through Game Winner? What are your thoughts on this year's Breeders' Cup Juvenile?
I see this as a two-horse race. I think this is a really fascinating East versus West matchup of two exceptionally talented 2-year-olds. The other one, of course, being Complexity, who won the Champagne. This is the race that I'm really most looking forward to on the Friday card. I just think these are two really nice horses who have been standouts in their prior races, and I'm interested to see which one turns out to be the superior horse, because based on speed figures, they're very close. I know Game Winner is the favorite, probably mostly due to the fact that he's already got that 2-turn experience, which can be very valuable in these races. And I've liked all of Game Winner's races. I think he is a really nice horse. He's a horse that I could even see getting better next year as a 3-year-old if the distances continue to stretch out, because given his pedigree, he's just really bred to run all day. The Candy Ride seems to do anything. And on the dam side, there's just so much stamina breeding. His dam is by Easy Indy. His second dam is Fleet Indian, who going back a number of years was a really top-class New York bred who won multiple Grade 1 races, won a couple of graded stakes going 1.25 miles on the dirt. So Game Winner is really bred to be that classic distance sort of horse. And I think we've seen that in his races. I mean, his biggest asset in his prior starts in California has been his stamina. He didn't look that exceptional in his debut, even though he ran a fast time, but subsequently he ran down his more highly regarded stablemate in the Del Mar Futurity, just kind of grinding that horse down, a roadster who was very well thought of prior to that race. And last time out, the American Pharaoh, I just loved the way he finished off that race. You could argue that, he got a pretty moderate pace to stalk and, really played into his strengths, but I thought he really strode out across the wire powerfully. And this is a really talented horse for Bob Baffert. I am not against him by any means, but I do think he faces a real rival in Complexity. I mean, you watch either of his races, and I've just been so impressed with this horse. He didn't break that sharply in his debut at Saratoga, but he just rushed up seamlessly on the rail and took the lead and never looked back. We've seen horses come back out of that race to run much faster. You can obviously see that, as you pointed out, in the TimeformUS charts. And last time on the Champagne, he broke on top and he laid down some pretty quick fractions. And if you watch, that race and just the way that horse was kind of conducting himself early on, I mean, he's just flicking his ears back and forth, like setting those fractions was absolutely nothing to him. And when Jose Ortiz set him down at the top of the stretch, he really kicked for home well. I know Code of Honor made a, kind of a dent in his eventual winning margin late, but it always looked like Complexity was, totally dominant that day. The 2 turns is a question mark, and you're going to notice he's a McLean's Music out of the Yes It's True dam, and maybe you say, oh, that's just all speed pedigree. But on the dam side, there really is some stamina breeding. He's a half to Valadorna, who I think was second in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies last year, and she's turned into a router subsequently. And the dam herself is actually a half sister to a winner of the Demoiselle, which is a 9-furlong race for 2-year-olds. So there is plenty of stamina on the dam side. And I just think this horse has a ton of talent. And if they use his speed and allow him to take the lead in this race, he could be pretty tough to catch. I'm looking forward to the duel that's likely to develop between these 2 horses.
It does have that classic East versus West feel. Craig, are those the 2 you're focusing on, or do you have something at a longer price on the Breeders' Cup Juvenile?
I think those 2 are clearly the most likely winners in here, but I'm going to add a 3rd horse, Code of Honor. I'm just wondering how long will, especially from that outside position, Game Winner is probably going to move up a little sooner than later on complexity. And, Code of Honor did have a little bit of a trouble at the break last time and then kind of, made a decent run late. Shug's not a horse that sends a lot of 2-year-olds to the Breeders' Cup that I can remember as of late anyway, for sure. The horse was, pretty surprising his first time out. He obviously had some talent, but when he went wire to wire at 6-1, that caused quite the Twitter buzz. Some people had him as their Derby horse already. And just seeing that we have this predicted as a fast pace in our pace projector, I think he's the horse that could most likely pick up the pieces. He's a little bit more of a price than the other two. I'm going to wait and see what the tote board says, but he's the one that's most likely a win bet for me. As far as complexity and Game Winner and him as well, I think this is a really solid crop. We never know what's going to happen with these 2-year-olds, as they turn 3 and try to move on to the Derby trail. But their speed figures alone tell you it's a really good group. Every bit as good as last year. And, I think we're going to see a great race. This is definitely the one as a fan I'm looking forward to most watching.
We had a question. We have some really good questions. The first one is about speed figures in general. And Craig, I'll ask you, do you think that there's a reliable conversion scale between Timeform ratings and the buyers?
I mean, if you just want to compare them to each other, of course, we all make our individual decisions on races, so it may not apply to every race. Of course, it won't apply to every race. But in general, we're just about 20 points higher than the buyer speed figures. Our scale is to the Timeform scale, which makes it, is one of our goals so we can compare Euro shippers when they come over to race against horses here in the U.S. and vice versa. When, our horses go over to Dubai, we can compare those to the Timeform ratings. But I would say 20 is a pretty good gauge, maybe a little bit higher on turf, maybe 22. But so somewhere right in there is pretty good.
I use that all the time, and I do find that it's a rough gauge, but I think when you're comparing figures, that's really what you're looking for. We have another general question, and then I'll ask your thoughts on some specific horses that listeners have chimed in with questions about. The general question is about the wet conditions. What effect do you guys feel like they will have? Will it cause you to bet less? Will it cause you to bet more? Are there any biases you might be on the lookout for as a result of the wet surfaces, presumably? And we'll start with David, though I will say it's not inconceivable that by Saturday, in fact, it wouldn't surprise me one bit if the dirt is absolutely fine. By Saturday, I do think the turf's definitely going to have that cut. David, how are you factoring in the weather to your horse playing this weekend?
Yeah, I agree with you. Just kind of watching races that are run at this time of year when you get some poor weather, the dirt courses can dry out as quickly as they do in the summertime, and the turf courses just seem to stay wet for a longer period of time because you don't have those warmer temperatures or the sun beating down on them for quite as long with shorter days. So I do feel like the turf courses are still going to be on the yielding to soft side on Friday and Saturday as long as the rain that's predicted actually appears. And at Churchill Downs, that can be a problem for horses, sometimes on the rail. The past few Derby weekends, especially that I've been paying attention, when we've gotten a lot of rain, you sometimes see the rail on the turf courses really not be the place to be. I don't know if that's because the way that the rain drains off the course or the way the moisture distributes itself, but the rail can sometimes be a lot deeper and you want to be rallying down the center of the course, or just if you're on a speed horse, just don't be right on top of the inside, kind of racing the 2 or 3 path. That can be much more to your benefit. So I do think you want to pay attention to how those races are playing, and you're probably not going to get much of a preview of that before the Breeders' Cup because they really have only scheduled dirt races around these Breeders' Cup races. So we'll have to kind of wait and see how things will play out. The kind of temptation once you see a lot of rain come is to take the European horses, but I think you do want to note which European horses have actually handled good to soft ground in the past, because a lot of the horses that are brought over to the U.S. from Europe are doing so because they want to get firm ground, and that's probably not going to be the case on Friday or Saturday. But it can be detrimental to some of the American horses. A lot of these horses that we have over here have only run over like really rock hard turf courses. We see that with a lot of horses coming in from California or Florida. So, these rain softened courses can be a problem.
Good analysis there. Lots of great information, and you just have to watch and see. I absolutely agree with what David said about those rails the last 2 Derby days getting wet. That was significantly more rain even than what's expected, though. Just going to have to use our eyes and react in real time, I think, but that's a very smart thing to keep an eye on. Craig, anything further about how the weather conditions might affect your work this weekend?
No, not in particular. Just the dirt. The superintendents do a great job these days getting the dirt to dry out. So unless it's raining the morning of or during the races, they usually do good. And we'll have plenty of prep races, earlier races on the card to watch those. One thing I'm always leery of on turf is, speed seems to do a little better the slower the turf gets, in my opinion. Horses seem to lose their kick. The races are run differently. The horses don't finish as well. So I tend to emphasize the early speed a little bit more. But as David says, you also have to watch where the course is playing well, because speed generally tends to wind up on the inside. So if the inside's not good, you got to avoid that.
All right, so we've got 3 questions about specific horses I'm going to ask, and then we're going to close out with a good one. I'll mention it now so you guys can start thinking about it. But we had a question from our friend and bingo card creator for the DRF Players Podcast, Gian Menez, about the best long shot. We're looking for a 15-to-1 plus from each of you to include in exotics on Friday. But first, a couple of specific questions about horses. The first one is Summering. Do either of you have any positives on Summering and the Glen Hill Farms horse, and think she might have a chance to beat Newspaper of Record?
I can take that one. I'm just not quite convinced that the quality of those stakes races out in California is quite at the level of the horses that we've seen, competing in New York or even at Keeneland, for that matter. You look at a horse like Lady Prancelot, who she ran with in those races, and she's okay, but I'm just not quite convinced that they're quite at this level. What I will say about Summering is that she didn't have an ideal trip in that Surfer Girl last time. She was a heavy favorite, and the last thing you want to see happen with a horse that's 2-5 is for her to kind of get buried in behind horses in a small field, and that's exactly what happened. And Drayden Van Dyke, it wasn't really his fault, because it seemed like she was almost lugging in under him, but he could never really get her off the rail and into a clear position. I just feel like she's going to have to run much faster than she ever has before, and I haven't really seen that out of her yet.
One of the horses.
Same for me. Yeah. Sorry, Peter.
No, you go ahead. Anything to add, Craig?
No, same for me. I just kind of downgrade these Southern California turf horses when they go up against the East Coast horses. I've seen too many East Coast horses ship in and, with poor looking form or lower class form into California and take grade 2s and grade 1s. And the horses shipping east from California just don't seem to run as well. The numbers bear it out as well. They're just not as good, in my opinion. So until proven otherwise, I'll keep being against these California horses.
One of the horses that's attracted just a ton of buzz. I've had multiple horsemen tell me how good this horse looks. A horse who's been supplemented to the Breeders' Cup, Topper T. The problem is, I keep looking at the form, and I just keep saying to myself, on form and figures I can't see it. But it's interesting how much buzz the horse has gotten. We did get a question from Ed. If either of you have any paper angle on Topper T, is this horse you'd consider using at all, based on all the positive excitement being generated by the physical appearance? Craig, we'll start with you on that one. Any love for Topper T?
No, none at all from me. He does. I guess if you're looking for a positive, he goes to the barn of Bill Mott, which I think that's almost an upgrade for anyone. But he's run 5 times now, I believe. He's an Iowa bred. He hasn't run particularly fast. So, I'm sure he's a nice horse, but he draws a bad post and he looks in over his head to me.
David, anything to add?
Yeah, I've got similar feelings. I do see plenty of speed in this Breeders' Cup Juvenile, speed that's importantly drawn to his inside, and I haven't seen the early zip out of him to suggest that he's going to clear all of them, including complexity, and get to the front. Maybe they try to run him off the pace, and I think that's going to be especially difficult given that post position. And he's got some pedigree to suggest that more distance will be his friend. It's just he's going to have to run a lot faster, and I don't quite see it in a race this tough.
All right, we have two things that I think we touched on pretty quickly, but we'll revisit for the folks who asked the questions. One, and David, I'll ask you this one because you already talked a little bit about Uncle Benny. You give the horse some count, yes?
Yeah, I do. This horse, if you see him, he's really, big, and he kind of gives you the impression that he's a horse that kind of, is robust enough to handle longer distances. He doesn't really look like a turf sprinter, and I was impressed with his debut at Monmouth. I know it was on the dirt, but I thought he was really commanding that day. And just the way that he won last time, I think, really suggests to me that distance is not going to be an issue, and he might have some more class than it might, that the data might suggest.
We also had a question, I'll hit this one to Craig, about Churchill being a track where, in this listener's opinion, horses need to get a feel for. Is it a negative to you to see Southern California horses coming here with no local works?
Well, no, I think Bob Baffert's put that notion to rest with the Derby. I've never really seen much problem with California horses shipping into Churchill, whether they work out there or not. They seem to handle it just fine, in my opinion.
All right, and then we'll get back to that final question. Each of you being asked to provide a 15-1 or higher to include in exotic bets on Friday. David, we'll start off with you.
Well, I've already talked about Uncle Benny enough, so I'll choose a different one. I'm going to go with Stillwater Cove in the turf sprint. I think she's 20-1 on the morning line. I'm not sure we'll get that price, but I just think this filly might be the least regarded of all of Wesley Ward's horses in this race. That, in my opinion, she might have the best chance. Don't put too much stock in her race at Royal Ascot and at Albany, because she just kind of ran off in the early stages and left nothing for the finish. So that's not a true indication of her ability. I've really liked both of her races back in the United States since then, and I think she's a horse that could outrun her odds in the spot.
All right, Craig, same question to you. An exotic bomber to throw in there.
This one will be close to 15-1, but I would maybe throw in Standard Deviation in the Juvenile. If you think the pace is going to get hot and they're going to hook up sooner rather than later, he's a nice horse. He's the other Chad Brown. He used to be the other Baffert. Now it's become the other Chad Brown. He's a horse that had basically a no-hope trip from the 13 post at Keeneland last time. He was wide all the way. He made a move around the turn before flattening out a little bit, but I think he's better than his 97 speed figure that day. I think he'll run better, and he could definitely pick up some pieces and get in the exacta, especially the trifecta.
Great stuff. I want to thank you both so much. One more time, just a reminder about Friday's guaranteed pools. The day starts off with $500,000 in the early pick 5 races 1 through 5. There's also a late pick 5 on the races we talked about on this show, races 5 through 9, and then the $1.5 million guaranteed all Breeders' Cup pick 4 on races 6 through 9. I want to thank Craig Milkowski. I want to thank David Aragona. Definitely made a lot of notes during this session and have annotated my PPs accordingly. And I thank you for your time. I want to thank producer Jake for manning the controls. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for tuning in, especially those of you who ask questions. Always so fun to get to interact with our audience. And I hope you've enjoyed the TimeformUS takeover of the DRF webinar on Breeders' Cup Friday. I'm Peter Thomas Fornatale, and you've been watching content produced by DRF.com.